Alright, friends and neighbors, welcome back to another networking video. I thought this time that we tackle a very specific issue that happens when we are dealing with virtual machines and their network connections. So we're going to do a little hypervisor networking. Now I suppose the first thing that we ought to remember is that when we have virtualized hosts, that all of their connectivity and the files and everything else are all controlled by the hypervisor, and that each virtual machine is a separate instance of an operating system. The machine that you're sitting on is called the host machine or the host OS, and everything connects out through the host OS. We have to remember that when we install a hypervisor, especially if we're doing type 2 hypervisors, right, that there's an impact on the host, or at least there's something that has to be done to get things to work. As an example, I've got a couple of VMs running right now. So this right here, right, is VMware Workstation. So it doesn't really matter if we are talking about VirtualBox or VMware Workstation, doesn't really matter. It's a hypervisor and it has to handle a couple of things for us. So I've got my VMs all here. And these VMs are separate instances of an operating system, in this case CentOS, and I'm running Windows 10 on my host OS. For the networking portion, which is what we're focused on right now, we have the virtual network editor. And the two big kinds of connections that I'm worried about are bridged connections and NATed connections. And we can see that we've got the NAT right here because NAT has to be configured. I can manage this. Bridged is something different. We'll talk about that here in a second. Then, of course, we've got host only here. Okay, so that's our virtual network editor that is managed by or from inside the hypervisor. Now, there's an impact on the hosts, too. I take a look at my network settings. Let me bring that over here. All right. I can see that I've got network adapters that are installed by my hypervisor. So without these, there would be no real way for me to handle virtual machine networking. And then we'll turn those on and we'll futz around with that here in a second. Okay, but let's get back to our slides. I've got my host OS sitting here and however many VMs I'm going to run off of that. But then I have to remember that if I want outside connectivity to the network, they've got to pass through the host OS, again, managed by the hypervisor, and then get out to the network. Now, the two big kinds of connections, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be network address translation or bridged. And we'll cover each one of those in a little more detail here. There is a host only, I suppose, but it's not the common one that we use for production VMs. It's there if we want an isolated network. All right. The key idea in bridged is that you're sharing a connection with the host. Whatever network the host is connected to, that's the one that you're connected to as well. If you are NATed, or network address translation, this is very similar to what we do on all of our home networks. Right? The VM sits on a private network that is managed by the hypervisor, and very commonly you get a 192.168 something address, and nobody from the outside world will be able to talk directly to the VM because the VM is sitting on that private network. This is not the same as bridged. A bridged node will be able to be touched directly from the outside world. So a couple of big questions are, where does my IP address come from for the VM? And is there a DHCP server out there somewhere? We'll see here in a minute, sometimes there's two DHCP servers. So these are key ideas if we're trying to figure out why you can't connect or whether or not you're going to be able to, what you'll have to do to fix things. So let's take a couple of situations. I've got 4 situations outlined here that are fairly common. The first one is that we've got a bridged VM and no real-world DHCP, meaning that out on the network that I'm connected to on the host, there's no DHCP server. And we can see my other possibilities of whether or not the VM is NATed or there's another real-world DHCP out there. Now, before I get too crazy, let's take a look at where those come from. If I take a look at my VMs, right, I can go to the settings for a particular VM, And I can see that I've got my network adapter. And in the case of this VM, this one happens to be NATed. Now this is an important thing here. This is a little gotcha, right? If I forget to have this connected to power on, or I forget that it's connected, right? These get unchecked, I'm going to have problems with my network connectivity. So I'm going to assume that we've got these two checked, and in this case we've got a NATed connection. Now my other VM that's sitting here is bridged. Okay, so fundamentally different kind of connection. So that's where those come from. This is where these two situations. And now the only question is there a DHCP server out there in the real world? All right, so our first case is that we've got no real world DHCP, and then we've got a bridge VM. All right, so the VM shares the same connection as the host, but the VM cannot get an automatic IP address. And it turns out that the host will also not be able to get an automatic IP address. So the host machine and the VM are sort of stuck, right? There's no way to get them automatic IP addresses from a DHCP server. So you've got to manually configure these, and you might even have to reset the network. So by default, without doing anything, can you connect out? No, you will not be able to connect out. Not until you fix those things. All right, let's take situation number 2. So all that we've done is we've jumped our little X over here. And now we have a real world DHCP. And all of a sudden, life is good. The VM is still sharing the connection with the host. The host gets an IP address, and the VM can now get an IP address, and we're in good shape. And the only gotcha now is whether or not we've got to reset our network connections, or whether or not we got those checkboxes. So can we connect out? Yep, you sure can. All right. Situation number 3. So in this case, this is that other VM where we've got an IP address from the hypervisor. So the VM is sitting on a network that's controlled by the hypervisor. It's a NATed network. And so everything is run by the hypervisor for that VM. So it's not on the same network as the host anymore. But in this case, we've said there's no real-world DHCP, and this causes a problem because the host might not be able to get an IP address, and if the host can't get an IP address, the hypervisor has no idea how to fix that either because the hypervisor is resident on the host. So the VMs and the host will not be able to get out to the real world unless you fix some stuff. You got to do some static configuration. So can we get out? No. So, situation number 4, okay? Let's give the real world a DHCP server. So once again, the VM gets an IP address, but it gets it from the hypervisor DHCP server. And the host has gotten an IP address from the real world DHCP server. So 2 DHCP servers. So the hypervisor understands everything that the host does. So the VM gets an IP address from the hypervisor and has that passed through by the hypervisor out to the real world in the same way that the host can. So, can we get out to the real world? Yep, we sure can because all of the networking is satisfied. Now, let's take a look at the IP addresses that my VM's got. So, if you remember this stream client, right, we went back here, and this is a bridged connector. So this means that it shares the host. And take a look at the IP address that my host got. So it's 192.168.15.47. So we can see that right here. Okay, right about here. And so the question is, where did that come from? Well, it turns out that if I look at my actual host, right, my host is connected to the 15 net as well. So this is, again, reinforcing the idea that the VM and the host are on the same network. Okay, what about my server sitting here? Well, this was a NATed connection. We said that that is a network controlled by the hypervisor. Well, what's the IP address that we got here? We can see right here that it's 192.168.17.129. Where in the world did that address come from? Well, if we go back to our virtual network editor, we can see the NAT configuration here is configured for the 17 net. Mystery solved. We can even see the DHCP settings that can be set up here as well, the range of IP addresses. So now we know exactly where the VM got the IP address from, and we know how connectivity works for these VMs. Well, there you go. A little hypervisor networking. Hopefully, those will solve, the majority of networking problems that come up. It's always about understanding the condition that the VM is in and the condition that the host is in. And then what are the networking conditions for the real world and for the VM networks. Hey, like and subscribe if I helped. And now that we've solved all those VM networking problems, we know those packets are going to reach those destinations.